Alexander Knysh is the professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Michigan and academic director of an Islamic Studies program sponsored by the St. Petersburg State University, Russia. His academic interests include Islamic mysticism, Quranic studies, the history of Muslim theological, psychological, philosophical, and juridical thought, and modern Islamist movement in comparative perspective. He has numerous academic and instructional publications on these subjects, including 12 books. His most recent books in English are Islam in Historical Perspective and Sufism, A New History of Islamic Mysticism. Alexander Knysh currently serves as section editor for Sufism on the editorial board of the Encyclopedia of Islam, 3rd edition, and is executive editor of the Encyclopedia of Islamic Mysticism and the Handbooks of Islamic Mysticism book series associated with it. He lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
First, I would like to thank everyone. Before showing you the PowerPoint presentation, which I tried to make as lively as possible, because of the format, as you know, it's very difficult to engage people who are hundreds, thousands of miles away from you, as well as students who are watching you from their screens in class. It's a pleasure and privilege to speak to you. I'll share with you my observations as to how the subjective personal experience, mystical experience, becomes mystical cosmology and metaphysics at the hands of Ibn Arabi and his followers. So I would like to thank Stephen and Denise for organizing this session, and I would also like to greet Marcia Hermansen, who serves on the same editorial board of the Handbook of Sufi Studies that we're editing together with E.J. Brill, based in Leiden in the Netherlands and in Boston, the United States. So the first volume is coming out in December of this year. It will deal with Sufi institutions. But today my presentation will deal with more subtle issues, less tangible. It's not brick and mortar, no institutions, but only pure thought and pure tasting, as we'll find out. So Abu Bakr al-ʿArabī, it's a place in Kalabath is a place in today's Uzbekistan near Bukhara. He talks about tasting in his book that Arthur John Arbery, the British scholar, translated as Doctrine of the Sufis. In fact, it is called the Book of Introduction to the way of the folk of the Sufis, or the folks of Sufism. A skeptical theologian, mutakallim, ill-disposed to Sufism, asked a contemporary of al-Hallaj, Abu al-Abbas ibn Arta, who died in 922 in Baghdad. He was beaten to death when he tried to intercede on behalf of Hallaj by his own sandals. The guard of the caliphs did that to him because the Hallaj was doomed to death, and when he came to petition the caliph or the vizier who was responsible for that event, he was not only expelled from the court, but he was beaten to death, so the legend goes. So before he was killed, he responded to the remark of a skeptical theologian, which you can read on your screens now. So the theologian basically accuses, you can read the verbatim, accuses Sufis of using strange, unusual terms to conceal a vicious doctrine. And Ibn Atta responded, we only do this because we're jealous of God, because we are completely under his power or in his hands. And we don't want others to taste the sweetness of this term, or rather the sensations that these terms conceal. So why I started with that? Because Sufis, as you know well, and Ibn Arabi is a vivid example of that, they use a lot of special terms, some of which are indeed incomprehensible to the outsiders. And as you can see, this custom of using this certain terms with different meanings, not with their usual meanings, was the custom that developed already at the early stages of Sufism development. And these are the terms for tasting and drinking. Here I quote from Ibn Arabi's Futuhat al-Makkiyah, with which you're all familiar. Hopefully at some point the complete translation will come out and we'll be able to enjoy it in English. But the Arabic text, which I translated here, says that God bestows as he wills upon every high and low form from the knowledges of specification, a knowledge through which he is known to no one other than the recipient specifically. In other words, each person has his or her own predisposition, and God provides knowledge to that individual in accordance with this predisposition. Istiyadad, it's called in Arabic. So these are the knowledges of tastings that are neither communicated nor told. In other words, he refers to irrational, intuitive, suprasensory knowledges, not to the rational knowledges or traditional knowledges acquired through from one person to another. It's a specific knowledge that is beyond reason and beyond the transmitted tradition of naql. No one knows them but those who have tasted them. It is not within the realm of possibility for him who has tasted them to convey them to him who has not tasted them. Again, this idea is probably also obvious to most of you. We talk about the difficulties communicating one's personal knowledge acquired through mystical experience to others, because as Ibn Arabi tells us, everyone has special channel to God, and God communicates to him or her through that channel a specific type of knowledge that he compares to tasting. If you haven't tasted the sweetness, for instance, of an apple, how would you describe it? Would you call it red? Would you call it green? It's sweetness. If no one has tasted a sweet apple before, he or she would not be able to recognize the reference. So the term tasting or taste is discussed at some length in the works of the individuals who are mentioned here in my PowerPoint presentation on this slide. Abu Nasr al-Sarraj al-Tusi, these are classic, Abu Bakr al-Kalabadi, whom I already quoted, Abu Abdurrahman al-Sulami, Abu al-Qasim al-Kushari, Abu al-Hasan al-Sirjani. It's a recent discovery. He was not known to the British scholars who tried to reconstruct the tradition, especially Nicholson and Darbery, but he was recently discovered, and we now know his work thanks to Professor Radke and Bilal Orfali and some other scholars. And finally, the last person that appears on this list is the author of the first extant treatise on Sufism in Persian. The previous ones had been written in Arabic. So dhawq is closely linked to mystical experiences, as you already saw. Dhawq is also discussed within the context of how mystics or Sufis practice their Sufism. And the main form of practice, as you no doubt know very well, is the dhikr and sama, that is recollecting God's name. So there is an intimate link, Sufi authorities argue, between tasting and the practice of the recollection of God's name, either collectively or individually. And the other important point that dhawq, I'm sorry, it's misspelled here, it's dhawq, is associated with ecstatic states of finding or encountering or meeting God. Wajd, tawajud, mawajid. An early Sufi from Syria, Abu Abdullah al-Ruzbari, who has a Persian name, so it means probably he originally hailed from Iran or Persia, confirms the intimate link between tasting and mystical ecstasy, or the experience of discovering or encountering God. Tasting is the beginning of ecstatic states, mawajid. When the people of absence from God drink, that is, probably they drink wine, that people who do not care about God, they lose their consciousness. When the people of presence with God drink, they come alive. So, as you can see, there's a juxtaposition of being absent from God and being present with God. And the presence with God intoxicates you. Abu Nasr al-Sarraj, who comes from Tus, it's a town near today's Mashhad in Iran, in northern Iran. He says in his book of Kitab al-Luma, Book of Flashes, usually translated as Book of Flashes, but I think it simply means the book of the essentials of Sufism. Luma is the smallest piece of food or morsel that keeps you alive. So it's the essential, it's something that is essential for everyone to know about Sufism. So in his book, which he composed in Persia, in Iran, in today's Eastern Iran, Khorasan, he talks about the taste, various Sufi states or psychological, spiritual states of finding God present in his creation. He talks about sobriety, intoxication, self-annihilation in God, subsistence, and he continually draws a parallel between physical inebriation caused by tasting wine on the one hand and spiritual intoxication or trance produced by the mystic's encounter with his divine beloved. Sarraj is not alone. Many early Sufis used wine poetry to communicate their ideas. They quote extensively one of the major wine poets, such as Abu Nuwas, who died in the early 9th century, who was a court poet, but who praised wine. Although my good friend and colleague, James Montgomery, who is at Cambridge, says that he was a teetotaler, and it was simply a literary conceit. God knows best, we don't know, but he wrote a lot of spirited descriptions of wine parties, drinking parties, boon companions. And what is interesting that Sufis use his poetry to communicate their idea of a psychological state of spiritual intoxication in God's presence. Sarraj uses conceptual or classificatory triads constantly. He says that Sufi states come not even in pairs, but in triads. For instance, he takes dhawq, the tasting, not as a freestanding independent concept, but the first unit in the triad of mystical states in which dhawq, tasting, precedes drinking and quenching thirst. And commenting on a saying about drinking by the renowned Egyptian Sufi Dhunnun al-Misri, who died in 960, al-Sarraj avers, when God desired to give them, lovers of God, drink from the cup of his love, he first gave them a foretaste, dhawq, of its pleasure and a tantalizing lick of sweetness. Sarraj concludes his discussion of tasting by quoting a poetic passage according to which only the person who has himself experienced or tasted the loss of the beloved can fully comprehend and relate to the tragedy of bereavement that he reads about or hears about. Al-Qushayri, in his famous epistle on Sufism, which is still being used by Sufis as a training manual, draws numerous parallels. So as you can see, he lived about 80 years, 60 years after As-Sarraj. He draws parallels between the mystical states of presence, hudur, sobriety, sahab, absence, ghaiba, and drunkenness. To sum up these early Sufi discussions of the states of tasting and drunkenness. Drunkenness causes the mystic to lose his sense of himself and his surroundings. Sobriety, on the other hand, sharpens his awareness of both himself and the things that surround him. When he is drunk, he sees nothing but God. When he is sober, he sees God and his creatures simultaneously, or rather, he sees God in everything or behind everything. I will proceed to the final manual in which drinking and tasting mentioned Ujwiri's Kashf al-Mahjub, the unveiling of that which is veiled. This Persian Sufi lived in the late 11th century, mid-11th and late 11th century, and he died in Ghazni in present-day Afghanistan. He emphasizes the somatic and sensuous nature of drinking and tasting. He says, here I'm using the translation of Reynold Nicholson, professor, Cambridge professor and teacher of Arthur Arbery, whom I mentioned earlier. This is more or less a paraphrase, but the Sufis call, but that's actually actual works of Ujwiri. The Sufis call the sweetness of piety, the delight of miraculous grace, and the pleasure of intimacy with God, of course, shurb, drinking. And they can do nothing without the delight of shurb. So it's their major driving force, according to Ujwiri, the motive. And this body's drink is of water, so the heart's drink is of spiritual pleasure and sweetness. Tasting, dhawq, resembles shurb, but it is used in reference to pleasure and pain alike. One says, dhuktu al-halawa, I tasted sweetness, or dhuktu al-bala, I tasted affliction. So as you can see, he is interested in the semantic underpinnings of these terms and emphasizes that drinking is always pleasurable, whereas tasting may be also painful. And before we proceed to Ibn Arabi, this is the final slide, which is important because it anticipates what I'm going to say in the rest of my presentation, focusing on Ibn Arabi and also on juxtaposition between Ibn Arabi and al-Hallaj. That was made not by me, but by the great French Islamologist Louis Massignon, who died in 1962. Al-Qushayri refers to the cognitive aspects of tasting and drinking. He gives As-Sarraj's triad, dhawq, shirb, that is dhawq tasting, shirb, shurb is drinking, and quenching thirst, riyy, cognitive connotation by describing tasting and drinking as fruits of divine self-disclosure. Hang on to this, tajalli, it's important. The outcome of divine self-unveilings, kashafat, or of sudden divine visitations or occurrences, waridat. This is important because he anticipates some later developments in Sufi gnoseology / epistemology and metaphysics. So this is the summary, again, of dhawq and related terms in early Sufi literature. Dhawq and related terms, that is intoxication, drinking, quenching thirst, in early Sufi literature meant to convey psychological, primarily ecstatic states experienced by Sufis in their quest to achieve closeness to God and to savor God's presence, that the pleasure and the sensation, the pleasurable sensation, this inevitably entails. I'm sorry for the garbled text here. The somatic, emotive, ecstatic connotation of these states to the point of the mystical total self-abnegation and even self-sacrifice are obvious and undeniable, at least to Louis Massignon, who mentions these states repeatedly in his famous book, Louis Massignon, Essay on the Origins of Technical Language of Islamic Mysticism. However, in Qushayri's epistle, we already find a correlation. I translated it into English. It was published in Reading, and I use this work a lot in my discussion. In Qushayri's epistle, we find already a correlation between experiential aspects of Sufi states, ahwal, and mystical metaphysics. So the personal mystical experience becomes a cosmic experience. I will say more about this when I come to Ibn Arabi's ideas. And what is important, al-Qushayri's epistle mentions God's self-unveiling, kashufat or kash, and tajalli, self-manifestation in material existence, and how this unveiling and self-manifestation of God is received by an individual mystic. Now we come to the metaphysical term in Sufism that resulted in what Al-Ghazali in the East, Lisan ad-Din ibn al-Khatib, who lived in the 14th century in Granada, but he was killed in Maghreb by his enemies, and Ibn Khaldun, who lived in North Africa and then in Egypt, they describe this term as the Sufism of the philosophers, Tasawwuf al-Falasifa or Mutafalsifa. As-Sufiya al-Mutafalsifa, that is, those who Sufis who pretend to be philosophers. Louis Massignon, who's a wonderful French intellectual who dedicated his whole life to studying the legacy of the Sufi martyr al-Hallaj, of whom you may have heard, probably you've heard. He was executed in 921, the same year his intercessor, Ibn Ata, perished at the court. Louis Massignon debunked this development as a retreat of later Sufism, especially Ibn al-Arabi, into what he calls unverifiable cosmologies, sterile mind games, esoteric science clubs, and opium dens of the supernatural. I quote his essay. Check it. Also, there's a French original, which you may consult. Now, how this metaphysical term is reflected in one Sufi, late Sufi's writings, Ibn Arabi. He attributes the term tasting not to the mystic seeking proximity with God or seeking the company of God, but to God himself. So the state of opening, that is the creation of the universe, is the state of linking the act of origination, takwin, to the things brought into being, or if you wish, you can say the act of applying God's power or predetermination, qudra, to its object, maqdur. And then he says a remarkable phrase, only God has the taste to accomplish this, dhawq. No one can perceive it because neither manifestation of God, self-manifestation of God, nor unveiling cash accessible to the humans are taking place here. Thus, Ibn Arabi argues that God's taste of things implies their being transferred from the realm of relative non-existence to the one of actual existence, that is, the empirical world which we inhabit. This ability and experience lies beyond the ken of human comprehension, including that of the prophets and messengers of God. Only God can create things by tasting them. It's a beautiful metaphor, no doubt, but we find plenty of those in Ibn Arabi. It simply is related to my argument, so I chose this one. Ibn Arabi talks about dhawq also in his Fusus al-Hikam. Today, scholars prefer to translate it as ringstones of wisdom, according to the most recent translations, but the bezels of wisdom are still being used, Ralph Austin's famous translation. But Abrahamov and Dudley, they use ringstones. Ibn Arabi refines his earlier discussion of dhawq, quoting the Quranic description of God as being witness to everything. He asserts that God knows by witnessing, not by intellectual reflection. God's witnessing is akin, he uses the Arabic, kadhalika, to tasting. So God's witnessing, shuhud, is the same as dhawq, tasting, which is gained directly through unfathomable innate experience, not through intellectual cognition or intellectual reasoning. Ibn Arabi then concludes, I did in bold, this is sound knowledge, the rest being nothing but guessing and conjecture, and as such, not knowledge at all. So dhawq is the ultimate knowledge, the foremost knowledge, against which, or in comparison to which, everything else, any other knowledge, fades into insignificance. However, as you know, Ibn Arabi's texts and his mind is full of paradoxes. He then, elsewhere, says that there is a certain category of people endowed with the special powers of imagination, ahl al-awham, or fantasy, who can gain a proper perception of the paradoxical creative principle, according to which the divine imagination, which has no tangible empirical existence, God's imagination definitely is not tangible or material and cannot be perceived, brings forth the material universe perceived by our senses. This, argues Ibn Arabi, is a rare and uncommon knowledge that one can obtain exclusively through direct tasting with dhawq. So he admits, contrary to what he has said earlier or in another treatise, that one can taste things, approximating the taste of things by God. In sum, tasting is the superior, almost godlike way of cognition, and it also a cognition cum creation. One cannot but think about the Hindu Maya here, but I don't want to go to engage in comparisons here because they are treacherous. Ibn Arabi repeatedly asserts the superiority of intuitive, divinely inspired knowledge of divine realities over the haqa'iq. The haqa'iq are the things the way they are, designed by God or devised by God, and these realities are covered by external appearances, which we all know deceive. Over the rational epistemology, he says that rational epistemology of falasifa or rationalist theologians, mutakallimun, falls to understand the divine realities. The preferred intellectual method of rational inquiry that is used by philosophers and the rationalist theologians may indeed help them to confirm the unity of God and uniqueness of God and assert his transcendent nature by means of an apophatic negation of their creaturely attributes. In others they say God is not this, not that, he is incomprehensible, uncomparable, transcendent, otherworldly. But a divinely inspired tasting and intuitive unveiling can combine both God's similarity and incomparability with his creatures. In other words, God's simultaneous transcendence and eminence. So tasting is the key here to understanding God's two modes of presence, transcendent and immanent. This thirst of the seeker of knowledge and It's also, this motif runs like a red thread across the entire texture of Ibn Arabi's text. The thirst of the seeker of knowledge is never quenched. Ibn Arabi insists that the Sufi Gnostics' thirst for knowing God is never quenched because, according to the Quran, the words of God are never exhausted. According to Ibn Arabi, these words are but the entities of his existent things. Therefore, the thirst of the seeker of knowledge never ceases. He never experiences quenching because his, that is the seeker's innate preparedness, istiadat, constantly seeks knowledge. Once this knowledge has been gained, it gives him the preparedness for the ever new knowledge, whether rationally obtained or divinely inspired. I use here a passage from Futuhat, translated by Chittik in his Sufi Path of Knowledge. So, as you can see, that superior knowledge, but it's this knowledge, if I may say so, has a sting in its tail because it propels or impels you to seek more knowledge. So now, seeing the Grand Master of Sufism from a critical perspective that was adopted by many Sufis and non-Sufis in particular, and also by the French Islamologist, Islamologue, Louis Massignon. We cannot but notice that the original Sufi notion of tasting undergoes a drastic change at the hands of Sheikh al-Akbar and the later Sufis generally. The psychological and emotive state of a mystic seeking intimate relations with God is transposed onto the metaphysical plane to denote the desire of possible things, mumkinat, to taste dhawq, the state of existence. Ibn Arabi's redefinition of the classical Sufi concept is indicative of what I have already described as the metaphysical turn in Sufism. Massignon has denounced it as an irremediable concession to syncretist monism. That is, the introduction into the unadulterated experiential gnoseology of early Sufism, exemplified for Massignon by al-Hallaj, of the alien Hellenistic syncretist vocabulary. This is, unquote, this is mentioned in Massignon's essay. So Massignon creates a binary opposition between the poet's burning lyric, that is Hallaj's poetry, describing his relations with God, intimate relations when he invites God as a loving, beloved guest into his heart, and the Gnostics' calculated, icy symbolism, unquote. He juxtaposes Hallaj's simultaneous experiential phenomenon of shatkh. Shatkh is, as you know, ecstatic utterance, with Ibn Arabi's theosophical syncretism, which is nothing but a degenerate form of Hallaj's, as well as Muhasibi's, Abu Talib al-Makki's, and Ibn Karam's, Hallaj's authentic Sufism, with its proselytizing apostolic universalism. Ibn Arabi's monism is a product of an alien Platonic inspiration for Massignon. It abandoned the sophisticated psychological introspection of the authentic early Sufism and is thus responsible for the tragic, I quote, divorce between ascetic discipline and mystical theology. Again, unquote, this is from essay. Whether we agree with Massignon or not, probably most of you won't, in Ibn Arabi's universe, the original experiential, somatic, and emotive aspect of dhawq gives way to sophisticated mystical gnoseology or epistemology, ma'arifa, without, however, entirely losing its original psychological and somatic connotations. The result is a curious hybrid of mystical psychology and mystical metaphysics that the British scholar of comparative religion, Gavin Flood, has aptly described as cosmological psychology. The problem with my and Massignon's analysis. And this is the final slide, so I apologize for going a little bit longer than I expected, but we still will have time, about 40 minutes for discussion, maybe 35. The problem with my and Massignon's analysis. This is a self-reflection and also reflection on the what is called Orientalists or Eurocentric notions that we use. As children of our age and culture, shaped as it is by enlightenment and its conceptualization of religious and spiritual phenomena as opposed to rational cognition, we may be using categories that were incongruent with the pre-modern evidence that we attempt to analyze. Pre-modern textual evidence, I would add. In particular, by using modern Eurocentric methods and analytical tools to make sense of pre-modern Sufi discourses, we may be creating a distinction between knowledge, gnosis, and personal experience of the divine that was alien or irrelevant to the Sufi creators of these discourses. What is undeniable, in my view, is that these pre-modern Sufis did have a special doctrine and terminology, as attested by the critic of Sufism mentioned at the beginning of my talk. You use terms and ideas, certain obscure ideas and obscure terms to conceal the viciousness of the doctrine. That doctrine was distinctive enough and strongly held by its adherents because it asserted the superiority of the way of knowing God over that of its competitors among the fuqaha, the mutakallimun, and the falasifa. So, and that was my final statement. So, Sufism is a special type of knowledge that combines somatic, experiential vocabulary and notions with metaphysics, creating what I already mentioned is described as cosmological psychology, and creating a unique strain within the Islamic culture that we still consider to be relevant to our own experiences today, as the existence of the Muhyiddin ibn Arabi society attests. Thank you.